Grace and peace to you from Onalaska First United Methodist Church. You're listening to our podcast. We hope you enjoy.
So in your bulletin, you'll see that the sermon is titled, what is it? Cleaning is next to godliness. That's a typo. The sermon is titled Cleanliness is next to godliness. Now, have you guys heard that phrase before? Cleanliness is next to godliness. I don't know where that came from. I don't know who invented that, but I think that mothers probably for centuries have been telling their kids that and making sure that they take their at least weekly bath. Make sure you scrub behind your ears. We put on our best clothes, our Sunday best when there's special occasions like parties or going to church. You know, we talk about, there's this thing called political correctness, PC. There's also, I think, something called cultural correctness, CC. And there is something culturally correct about having everything in order, having things clean and presentable. There's just something about that in our culture that we value. And I sometimes wonder, this is not what I want to preach about, but I sometimes wonder if people skip out on church because they know that they don't have the means to be culturally presentable, right? I don't have good clothes that I can put on, and so I don't want to embarrass myself, and I'm just not going to go to church. I wonder if that happens for some people, and whether we ought to maybe revisit that at some point. But that's not what I want to talk about today. What I do want to talk about is how this idea of being clean and being presentable, it's not a new idea. In fact, first century Judaism, in the text that we just read, the time of Jesus in the Holy Land around Jerusalem, this was very much something that they valued. Except that they believed, and perhaps we do too, that it wasn't just cleanliness is next to godliness. For them, they believed that their salvation actually depended upon being presentable. Today's text, it was a long one. It shows us the beginning of the ministry of Jesus according to the Gospel of Mark. Okay? Now, Mark was a disciple of Peter, and I imagine that he would walk around and ask Peter all kinds of questions. What was it like hanging out with Jesus? And he's taking notes, and eventually he writes his gospel. We think this was probably the first gospel account that was written, the book of Mark. And so Mark, this is how Jesus begins his ministry. And he kicks off his ministry with three miracles, three distinct miracles. The first one, you heard it if you were listening, he's in the synagogue teaching, and a man who's possessed with an unclean spirit begins kind of heckling him from the crowd, and Jesus drives out the unclean spirit. The next one, he goes to Peter's house, and Peter's mother-in-law is in bed with a fever, and he takes her by the hand and lifts her up, and the fever departs from her. And then the third one, and he spent some time just in the house there healing people. But the third one, he goes out into the crowd because he's there to preach the good news that the kingdom is among you, which is what he came to do. And this man with a skin disease, a leper, approaches him for a miracle. Excuse me. And it was this third one that caught my attention. I want to read this again to you. A leper came to him begging him, and kneeling, he said to him, "If you choose, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I do choose. Be made clean." Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. After sternly warning him, he sent him away at once, saying to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them." that caught my attention. We have this guy approaching Jesus. He's got a skin disease. Now, we translate it as leper. It's probably not the same leprosy that we know today. That word that they use there could mean any number of skin diseases. But this guy's got a skin disease, probably no cure for it, and he comes to Jesus asking for a miracle. And you may have noticed in this story, he does not ask to be healed. He asks to be made clean. That seems strange, doesn't it? I mean, for us here today, like if I just got diagnosed with cancer, I'm going to begin praying to be healed from my cancer. What I would not pray for is to be made clean. That's a weird way to ask Jesus for a miracle. But you have to understand how the laws worked for these first century Jews. Listen to what Leviticus chapter 13, 45 and 46 says. This is what this says. The person who has the leprous disease shall wear torn clothes, and let the hair of his head be disheveled, and he shall cover his mouth and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. Okay? These are the laws in place during this time. Very strict purity laws. And so there's this understanding that there are any number of things that can make a person unclean. There are certain foods that you abstain from. By eating those foods, you could become unclean. There are all kinds of things that can come out of your body that makes one unclean. Any blood, any sore that oozes or pus or anything that comes from the inside out makes you unclean. Touching something that's dead, whether a person or an animal, makes you unclean. The first guy in the synagogue, he was possessed by an unclean spirit, so an unclean spirit had entered into him. Now, today, we don't really know what's going on there, but I could imagine that this is something like maybe mental illness or epilepsy or something like that, and you see this guy and you say an unclean spirit has entered him. Even touching somebody else who is unclean, even touching their clothes, can make you unclean. And then there's just this overall understanding that if a person is unclean, God has inflicted this upon them because of their sin, right? So if you're unclean, it's your own fault. You did something and God inflicted this upon you. And so for a person with leprosy like this guy who approaches Jesus, this is a lifetime of embarrassment. You've heard of the Scarlet Letter or read the book, The Scarlet Letter. She has to wear the letter A on her chest to let everybody know that she committed adultery. The person with leprosy is like that. You have to tear your clothes. You have to mess your hair up. You have to run around and shout, "Unclean, unclean," to everybody. "I'm unclean. I'm unclean. Don't get near me. I'm dirty." You can't even live inside the community. You have to pop up a tent outside of the camp. That's where you have to be, right? And this is a lifetime of being a social outcast. And you may think, okay, well, perhaps it was the germs that they were worried about. Maybe that, you have leprosy, I don't want to catch it, and so I don't want to get near you because it's communicable and I could get sick and then I'd be unclean too. It's not germs. It's not germs they were worried about. They believed, rightly so, that God is pure. God is pure. And so the belief is that with God being holy and pure, anything that is impure cannot exist in the same place where God is. In other words, wherever impurity is, God is not there because God is pure. So wherever impurity exists is a godless, forsaken place. So for first century Jews, cleanliness is literally next to godliness. Or the reverse of that, impurity is next to godlessness. So you can see that for them, having everything in order, literally their salvation depends upon it. You can either be in the same space where God is or outside of that, away from that. And so here we have this guy approaching Jesus, breaking the law, by the way. What is he supposed to do? Unclean! Don't come near me! I'm unclean! But yet he approaches Jesus and says, if you choose, you can make me clean. And Jesus says, I do choose. So you can see his number one concern is not a healing like we might imagine. If I have cancer, I want to be healed of my cancer. His number one concern, what he's saying is, I don't want to be God-forsaken anymore. I don't want to be an outcast anymore. I want to be where God is. Please remove this thing from me that separates me from God. That's his number one concern, not the skin disease. And this is why it's so important. It's a tiny detail in the text. It is really, really important to note that Jesus doesn't just speak healing over him. What does he do? He reaches out and touches this man, thereby effectively making Jesus unclean, defiled, impure, by touching the man. But Jesus reaches out and touches him and says, I do choose. Be made clean. Now, we know who Jesus is, because we've read the stories. This man did not know who had just touched him. Maybe he's a prophet. Maybe he's a miracle worker, a healer, a righteous teacher. But this guy doesn't know that this is God in the flesh who has just come down into this place and just reached out to touch this unclean man. He doesn't realize what has just happened. The theological statement that was just made is that God will go to any place, clean or not, and will go to any length to reach us. In just a few chapters, Jesus is going to elaborate on clean and unclean and what that means. And he says to some Pharisees, he says, there's nothing outside of the body or nothing that can enter a body that makes one unclean. There's actually no foods that you can eat that make you unclean. There's no person that you can't touch and become unclean. There's no clothes that can come in contact with you. There's nothing on the outside of the body that makes one unclean. He says there is something that makes you unclean, though. It's what comes from the inside. Those things that well up inside of you, and you choose to act upon those, what comes out of you, those are the things that make you unclean. But things on the outside, they can't do it. And so, this small picture of this healing, this becomes the hallmark of the ministry of Jesus. Jesus constantly hanging out with the wrong people, eating with the wrong people, touching the wrong people, crossing all kinds of culturally correct boundaries. He's ignoring the CC. And some of them, like this leper, are labeled unclean by society because of something that's out of their control. God didn't give leprosy to this man as part of payment for sin. And touching this man doesn't make me unclean. So part of the people he was hanging out with were those who were incorrectly labeled as unclean. But he went past that too, because he's also hanging out with people who were unclean because of what was coming out of them. Right? Didn't matter to Jesus, because he was here to make a statement. He's not only redefining what is clean and what is unclean, he's also redefining how God responds to us wherever we are. This idea that purity and impurity cannot exist in the same place, he's completely overturning that and saying, no, God does come to these places, and God touches, and God makes clean. Unfortunately, I think that some of this stuff has held on and even meets us where we are today. We don't have those same laws. We understand germs better. We understand how all that works. But some of that stuff still happens today. I mean, we have folks around us. You can probably imagine them in your mind right now. Folks that you look around and you say, "Ooh, thank God I'm not that person." Right? Homeless folks, folks with diseases that are communicable, folks with diseases that have no cure, folks with mental disabilities, folks that are chemically imbalanced. There are folks among us that we stop and say, I am glad that I'm not that person. And sometimes I think we begin to wonder, or maybe imagine in our mind, if the troubles that this person is experiencing is perhaps an indicator that they are indeed forsaken by God. Perhaps that homeless person is homeless because God's trying to teach them a lesson. And so we'd rather not get mixed up in their lives, just in case any of that starts to rub off on us. Maybe you're sitting here this morning and you are the one who has been shunned. Maybe you feel like an outcast in society. Or perhaps, maybe you've made mistakes. Some of that stuff on the inside has come out and you feel unclean and you start to believe that God could never approach you or love you or be near you. Perhaps you begin to wonder if the problems you are having in your life are an indicator that God has indeed forsaken you. You know, whether our impurity is culturally imagined, like the leper, or whether it's real because of the choices we've made, and we've all made bad choices. We are all unclean in that way. But whether it's imagined or real, I want you to know that the coming of Jesus, the one named Emmanuel, which literally means God with us, the coming of Jesus changes everything. And it's both good news and it's challenging news. Right? I mean, the good news is that there is no place that you can go where God is unwilling to go. That's good news. I say that at the end of every sermon. There's nothing you can do that would separate you from the love of God. There's no place that you can go that God isn't already there waiting for you. That's good news. It means that we don't have to get cleaned up before God will turn toward us or listen to us. It means that God comes to us and touches us right where we are. And if we desire to be cleaned up, God says, I choose. I am willing. But it's a challenge, too, at the same time, because if you're hoping to hide from God in your sin, if you think I can go someplace and just dwell in my own secret desires, well, I got bad news for you. God is there, too. And it also means that we are challenged and called to stop judging people. We're not to look at each other and wonder if perhaps the troubles they are experiencing, sickness, poverty, whatever, we're not to look at them and say, perhaps God is working here and this person is forsaken. It also means that we are not to avoid those people. We are called to get mixed up in their troubles, like Jesus got mixed up in the troubles of the people that he came to proclaim the good news. That's our job too, to get involved with those very people. Because those are the places where God is found. The alleyway where prostitutes and addicts are hiding out, God is in that place. The shabby tent that's propped up under the freeway overpass, that's where God is. The hospital bed with the patient dying of AIDS, that's where God is. Jesus goes to those places, and Jesus lays his hands on those people and says, even if no one else loves you, I love you. And I do choose, because you are precious to me. So this whole story that we have been reading since September, since God created humanity and humanity turned away from the good things that God had, and ever since then we just can't seem to get back on track, and we keep turning away from God over and over and over again. And God says, I'm going to raise up a people through which I will bless the whole world. And that doesn't really work out so much either. But God doesn't abandon the plan and says, not to worry, I'm going to preserve my people, and I'm going to raise up a chosen one that I choose, my anointed. I'm going to raise up that king, and this king will be a new type of king and will change everything. That story that we've been reading, guess what? We have now reached the climax of the story, because the birth of Jesus changed everything. This is the king who we have been waiting for. This is the message from God who reaches out and says, I do choose. And that's good news. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, thank you, God. Amen.